The last time a wolf invoked the right of forced claiming inside the Greymere Citadel, the war that followed had lasted 9 years and buried 4 pack leaders before it ended. That had been 40 years ago. Maris had read about it 3 times in Lord Fenwick's archive, in a water-damaged record written by a scribe who had been present that night, and had never recovered his composure enough to describe it as anything other than the worst thing he had ever witnessed. Maris had not understood, when she first read it, why the scribe had been so shaken by a single political act. She understood now. She pressed herself against the cold stone column at the edge of the citadel's upper gallery and watched Lord Alpha Varric of House Morvale hand his seal to the registration clerk below, and she understood the scribe completely. The accord signing had drawn pack leaders from all 6 territories of Sylvain. Below her, the great ceremonial floor blazed with the light of 100 torches. Territorial lords stood in clusters of alliance and rivalry, their ceremonial furs catching the gold of the flames. Warriors lined the walls with their arms crossed and their eyes moving, cataloging exits and threats simultaneously. Noble daughters in pale silver gowns circulated between the clusters with the practiced ease of women who had been taught from childhood that every conversation was a negotiation. Maris had come as a scribe, Lord Fenwick's record keeper, officially. Ink-stained fingers, a leather satchel, a registry ledger that gave her a reason to be present without requiring anyone to remember her face. No one was supposed to look at her twice. She had been so careful for so long. 8 months of varying her routes through every city she passed through, of choosing lodgings near back exits, of carrying a second set of documents in the lining of her cloak in case she needed to become someone else before morning. 8 months of learning to moderate her breathing when someone spoke his name in a crowded room. 8 months since Cadron of the Ashenmere had looked at her across a treaty hall, very much like this one, gone completely and unnervingly still, and changed the entire shape of her life before she fully understood that it was happening. She pressed her fingers to the mark on her collarbone without meaning to. The habit had become as automatic as breathing. A small scar in the hollow where her neck met her shoulder, placed there 4 months ago in the darkness of a forest clearing that smelled of pine and cold river water, pressed there gently by a man whose reputation made seasoned warriors step back in crowded rooms. The king of the Ashenmere, the last sovereign, they called him. The wolf whose territory stretched from the northern icebreak to the eastern cliffs, and whose name had ended 3 attempted coups without a single drawn blade. The one who sat at every high council with a stillness so complete it made the air around him feel like a held breath, and who spoke rarely, precisely, and in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Cadron had come into her life 11 months ago at a border summit in Draven, where she had been present as nothing more than a note-taker for Lord Fenwick's household. Walking quickly through a side corridor, already late, searching her satchel for the document she was supposed to have in hand, she had not seen him until she was already in the corridor. He had stepped out of a doorway, and they had nearly collided, and he had caught her arm to keep her from stumbling, and in the half-second before she looked up to apologize, she had felt something she had no name for, a recognition that lived below thought, a certainty that arrived fully formed, without the preliminary of doubt. When she looked up, he was already looking at her, utterly still, in the manner of a wolf that has caught a scent it did not expect. "Your name," he had said. Not a question. She had told him. And the way he had said it back to her, slowly, as if testing the weight of it, had been the beginning of everything. The months that followed had been unlike anything she had the vocabulary to describe. Secret meetings arranged through channels she did not know existed. Conversations that began at dusk and ended so close to dawn that she sometimes walked back through a sleeping city in the first gray light of morning. A man who was nothing like the legend she had assembled from rumor and fear. "I cannot announce this yet," he had said, the night he had given her the mark. His hands had been careful, almost reverent, his eyes holding something she had not expected to find there. Uncertainty. Varek has been positioning himself against me for 2 years. He controls 17 packs under informal fealty in the northern corridor. He has been searching for leverage. If he learns about you before I have dismantled what he is building, he will come for me, she had said quietly. Kadrin's jaw had tightened. He will try, which is why I am asking you to wait. Not long. A few months. Let me protect you in the only way I currently can, by ensuring you remain invisible to him. She had pressed her palm flat against his chest. His heartbeat had been slow and steady beneath her hand, steadier than it should have been for a man making such an admission. I swear it on this bond, he had said. The moment it is safe, I will stand before every pack in Solvane and declare what you are to me. No shadows, no silence between us and the world, just the truth. She had believed him. She still believed him. Her free hand drifted without thinking to her lower belly, where a different kind of truth had been quietly, irrevocably establishing itself for the past 6 weeks. A truth she had not yet spoken aloud. A truth she had been planning to tell him at their next meeting, 3 days from now, in the clearing by the river road where they always met. Everything had been meant to happen in a certain order. Then Varek had walked through the citadel doors. He was not supposed to be here. The Morvale Reach had declined the accord 3 years consecutively. His presence in this hall was not diplomacy. It was not coincidence. It was not anything she could explain with any interpretation that did not make the cold in her chest spread outward through her entire body. She pulled back further against the column. The shadows up here were deep enough. She was one of 12 people leaning against the upper railing. There was no reason for his eyes to climb the gallery stairs and find her specifically. His gaze climbed the gallery stairs, found her in 3 seconds. His nostrils flared once, slow and deliberate. A smile moved across his face, unhurried and certain. The smile of a man who had traveled a long way to confirm a suspicion and had just received the confirmation he needed. The mark on her collarbone erupted with heat so sudden and violent that she nearly made a sound she could not afford to make. Varek took one measured step toward the gallery stairs, and Maris understood, with a clarity so cold it felt like plunging into winter water, that he had not come to Solvane for the accord. He had come because he had found out where she would be. He had been waiting for exactly this moment. He climbed the gallery stairs without hurrying. That was the worst of it. Not the certainty in his eyes as they tracked her through the shadows. Not the 2 wolves in Morval colors who materialized from positions she had not noticed, flanking the staircase below as if placed there in advance. The worst of it was that he did not hurry. He moved like a man who had already accounted for every variable, who had run this exact sequence in his mind so many times that the real world required no urgency whatsoever. Maris did not run. Running in a hall full of wolves would only accelerate what was already coming. She pushed away from the column and moved deeper into the gallery, keeping her pace measured and purposeful. A woman walking somewhere she was supposed to be. Varek crested the landing and found her with his eyes before she had covered 10 paces. There was no blending. There was no invisible. Maris, he said. Just her name. A statement of possession so smooth and quiet it barely registered as threatening to anyone not close enough to see his expression. The other attendants in the gallery drifted away. Instinct. The deep woven instinct that recognized dominance pressure and evacuated the space around it without conscious thought. Maris stopped moving. She turned to face him. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. I am afraid I do not know you, my lord, she said. You know who I am. His voice was even, almost pleasant. Just as I know who you are. Maris, record keeper to Lord Fenwick, previously documented under 2 other names in the river cities over the past 8 months. He tilted his head. You are very good at being unremarkable. Most wolves with nothing to hide do not need to be. I value my privacy. There is no law against it. No, he agreed. He studied her in silence, and the quality of that silence pressed against the skin. You smell of something you are working very hard to suppress, something old and quite powerful. His gaze dropped briefly to her high collar, then rose back to her eyes. I want to know what it is. I am a common wolf, my lord. I carry no mark. I hold no bond. The lie fell from her lips with the smoothness of long practice. Varek looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he descended the gallery stairs, and the gesture he made with one hand was so small and so casual that she needed a full breath to understand its meaning. He was not asking her to follow. His men were going to ensure that she did. The two wolves in Morvale colors moved up the stairs. They did not touch her. They did not need to. Their presence on either side communicated everything without the evidence of physical contact. She walked. The main floor of the citadel was still full. The accord signing had not formally begun. Varek walked to the center of the floor, turned to face the assembled hall, and waited for Maris to be brought to stand before him. Every conversation stuttered and fell silent. Heads turned. The assembled wolves of 6 territories watched with the quality of recognition, the held-breath awareness of something enormous that had not yet fully announced itself. I invoke the right of public declaration, Varek said. The silence that followed was absolute. Every wolf in Solvane knew that law. It was older than the current territorial borders, older than the accord itself. An alpha could invoke it in a gathering of witnesses to stake a claiming intention before any other party could intervene. Once spoken, the declaration created a 72-hour window during which no other claim could be lodged. It was considered, in the current era, a barbaric relic. Varek invoked it without a flicker of embarrassment. I declare my intention to claim Maris, record-keeper to Lord Fenwick, as my bonded mate, before witnesses, before the assembled packs of Solvane. His eyes settled on her with absolute certainty. She bears no prior mark. She holds no existing bond. My claim is uncontested. Varek lifted his hand toward her collar, and every wall she had spent months constructing came down in the same instant. Not from fear, though the fear was real and enormous and sitting directly behind her ribs. Not from desperation, though that was real too. From something older and fiercer than either. From the place inside her where the mark lived, where the bond lived, where months of silence had been storing every whispered promise, every moment she had believed with her whole self that she was not alone in what she carried. She moved before she thought. She stepped back from his reach. She raised her hands to her collar. She pulled it aside. She turned the mark on her collarbone toward the nearest torch. The scar blazed in the light. Small, precise, unmistakable to any wolf who had ever learned what a claiming bite looked like. The hall went so quiet that Maris could hear her own heartbeat. She is claimed, she said, and her voice shook, but it carried. I bear the mark of Cadrin of the Ashenmere. I have borne it for 4 months. Any claiming you perform here tonight is not a bonding. It is a declaration of war against the last sovereign himself. Not a single person in the Greymere citadel moved. Varek's hand lowered. The silence stretched. And then he smiled. It was not the smile of a man who had been outmaneuvered. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Do you think, he said softly, so softly that only she could hear him, that I did not already know? The hall did not erupt immediately. It broke apart slowly, cracks spreading outward before the collapse announced itself. Pack leaders turned to their seconds. Warriors shifted position. Voices rose in overlapping currents of shock, and the specific agitation that lives in a room full of wolves when something irreversible has just happened in front of them. Maris moved through it the way she had learned to move through everything in the past months. Quietly, without appearing to flee. She walked the length of the eastern wall toward the passage that led to the residential wing. She did not run. She counted her own footsteps the way she did in the worst moments, when the counting was the only thing keeping her breathing even. She reached the passage door. She went through it. And then she ran. The residential corridors were nearly empty, nearly everyone having gone to witness the proceedings. Maris ran through them with her satchel clutched to her chest, up 2 flights of the servants' stairwell, until she reached the small, high-ceilinged room that Lord Fenwick's household had been assigned. She did not stop to light the candle. She packed by the gray light through the narrow window. A traveling pack, 3 changes of clothes, the coins sewn into the lining of her spare cloak, the herbs bundled in oilskin at the bottom of her satchel, the ones that had been managing the morning sickness that had threatened to betray her long before she was ready to acknowledge what it meant. She paused with the herb bundle in her hands. 6 weeks. She had known for 6 weeks. She had been so careful not to let it show in her face or her posture, or the way she sometimes pressed her palm flat against her stomach in quiet moments. Kadrin did not know. She had been going to tell him in 3 days, at the River Road clearing, in the specific words she had practiced until they no longer caught in her throat. He was not going to learn it that way now. She crossed to the window. East of the citadel, beyond the market district and the dense midland forests, lay the Ashenmere, his territory. The place where she had always imagined they would eventually end up together. Not as a secret. Not as something hidden and half-held. As something announced. Something true. Instead, she had handed Varek the exact moment he had been engineering. She pressed her fingertips to the cold glass. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am coming to you. Not the way we planned, but I am coming." She pulled her cloak around her shoulders and did not let herself stand at the window for more than one more breath. The servants' gate at the rear of the citadel opened onto a narrow lane running east toward the market district. She took it fast and quiet, her breath rising in small clouds in the cold air. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on the lane ahead and walked, then ran, then walked again, when the lane opened into the market streets and running would be noticed. She did not see the figure standing at the servants' gate long after she had gone. She did not see Varek's man, the one who had been positioned at that exact gate for the past 3 hours, watching her go with a lantern in his hand. She did not see him turn away to write the message dispatched before the citadel clock struck midnight. The message was short. It said only, "She has confirmed the bond. She is running east. The king will follow." Below those words, in a different hand, someone had added 4 more. "Let him. We are ready." 2 months after the Greymere citadel, the village of Crestholm had mostly stopped noticing that Nara the bookbinder was new. She had arrived in the last bitter grip of winter, a young widow traveling alone with a traveling pack and a story that did not invite questions. A husband lost to a fever on the road east. No family to return to. A trade she could practice anywhere. A village needed its contracts copied and its record ledgers kept in order. The village elder had looked at her swollen belly and her steady hands, and her eyes that held grief in the way that grief settles in people who have decided to keep moving regardless. And he had pointed her toward the empty room above the tanner's workshop without asking for anything she could not afford to give. She had accepted without hesitation. Now the last frost had broken, and pale green was pushing through the dark soil of the kitchen gardens, and Maris had become simply Nara. The bookbinder who kept her lamp burning later than anyone else on the lane, the woman who paid for her bread in advance, and never asked anyone for anything. She was surviving. She told herself each morning that surviving was enough. The scar on her collarbone refused to agree with her. It had not faded. She had checked every day at first, standing at the small square of polished copper she used as a mirror, tilting her collar aside to look at the mark that should, by every law of woven bonding she had ever learned, be softening. When a bond was severed or abandoned, the mark faded. It was not comfortable. It was not quick. But it happened. The body took back what the bond had given. The mark looked exactly as it had the morning after Kadrin had made it. Sometimes at night, when the village was fully quiet and the baby had finally stilled against her ribs, she thought she could feel something through it. A presence at the far edge of perception. patient and searching, moving the way a wolf moves through a territory it knows but cannot currently see. She told herself that was wishful thinking. What she believed, when she was honest enough to allow it, was that she had made a terrible miscalculation the night she pulled open her collar in the citadel and spoke his name aloud. Not because naming him had been wrong, not because protecting herself from Varric had been wrong. Because Varric had smiled. She had not yet worked out what he had to smile about. She was still working on it on the morning young Dessa came running down the lane from the village square, her face bright with the kind of excitement that lives next door to fear. "Nara," she called, breathless. "There are traders in from Draven. They are saying things about the capital, about the Alpha King." Maris set down her binding tool slowly. "What things?" she asked. The traders had come from Draven in a wool caravan, 6 wagons and 9 men with road-worn faces. By the time Maris reached the village square, half of Crestholm had already gathered around their lead wagon, and the trader in charge, a broad sun-weathered man with a gray beard and the careful eyes of someone who had learned that information was its own currency, was in the middle of a story that held the crowd entirely still. Maris stood at the edge of the gathering and listened. "Cadrin of the Ashenmere has called Varric of House Morvale before the High Council," the trader was saying. "Formal charges of territorial aggression and unlawful claiming attempt at the Greymere Accord. Every pack leader in Sylvain has been summoned to the capital to witness the proceedings." Murmurs moved through the crowd. Maris pressed her hand to the side of her belly and said nothing. "They say the last sovereign himself has been riding the road between the Ashenmere and the capital for 6 weeks. The trader continued. "No one has seen him stay in one place longer than a night. His beta, the one they call the Iron Second, has been deploying wolves to every village between the Midlands and the Eastern Territories." "Searching for what?" someone in the crowd asked. "For who?" the trader corrected. He paused, savoring it. "There was a woman at the Accord signing in Greymere, a record keeper they say, though the pack leaders who were present describe her as rather more than that. She stood in the center of the citadel floor and bore witness to Varric's claiming attempt herself. She named the last sovereign in front of 600 wolves. She bore his mark openly before all of them." Total silence. "And then she disappeared," the trader said. "Vanished before anyone could speak to her. Cadrin's charges against Varric rest entirely on her testimony. Without her account, Varric's advocates claim the Accord Declaration was lawful, and the mark she displayed was fabricated." He shrugged. "Varric has put a warrant out for her. Claims she is a manipulator who orchestrated the whole thing to embarrass his house." "And what does the Alpha King claim?" the elder asked. "The Alpha King has not made public statements," the trader said. "What he has done is personally questioned every settlement between Draven and the Northern Ridge. His wolves have been at villages east, west, and south of the capital. They say when he reaches a place and she is not there, he does not rest before moving on. They say his second has been begging him to sleep." The trader turned his cup in his hands. A man who behaves like that is not looking for a witness to his legal case. No one in the square spoke. The baby pressed hard against Maris's ribs from 2 directions at once, a movement so sudden and forceful that she gasped before she could stop herself. Several heads turned toward her. She smoothed her expression, made herself breathe. He was searching for her, not through messengers or court apparatus. He himself on the road, village by village, not sleeping when he did not find her. Varric had called her a fabricator, had told 600 wolves that the mark was false, that she was a manipulator. He was not just trying to silence her. He was trying to hollow out the truth of what had happened until nothing remained that could be used against him. If she did not get her testimony to the High Council in time, Varric would win the hearing, and she was the only witness who could stop him. Maris was still processing this, rapid and alarming, when the movement at the far tree line caught her eye. She went still. A single wolf stood between the outermost oaks at the village's western boundary. Large, long-legged, with fur the color of deep river mud. Its eyes caught the morning light with an intelligence that was not animal. As she watched, it lowered its head and looked directly at her. Not at the crowd, not at the wagons, at her. The mark at her collarbone ignited. She turned away from the tree line before any expression could settle on her face and walked, measured and unhurried, back up the lane toward the workshop. She did not run until she was around the corner and out of sight. But the mark did not cool, and when she reached her door and looked back, a second wolf had joined the first, then a third. None of them wore cadron silver. She had 40 breaths, perhaps, before they moved. Maris calculated this with the cold precision of a woman who had spent months learning to think in exits and margins. The wolves were at the western tree line. The back of the tanner's workshop faced east. The lane between them and her was narrow but open, nothing to break a wolf's stride. She went inside, barred the door, and thought. Her pack was already mostly assembled. She had never fully unpacked it, not in the way a woman unpacks who believes she will stay. She pulled out the silver-edged belt knife she had purchased 3 weeks ago, the one she had told herself was for protection against the forest, the one she had known, if she was honest, was for this exact moment. She moved to the back window. The second wolf had already circled. It stood in the narrow alley behind the workshop, 30 feet away, watching the back of the building with the focused patience of a wolf that had been given a specific task and intended to complete it. She counted the ones she could see. 3 at the western tree line. 1 in the back alley. There would be more she could not see. Varek's hunters did not come in small numbers. The scar at her collarbone burned with an intensity that was almost beyond bearing. He was close. Not the hunters. Not Varek. She would not feel Varek's proximity through that mark. She would not feel anything through it except one specific person. And the fire it was producing right now told her that person was somewhere nearby and closing distance fast. She could not let him walk into whatever Varek had set without warning. The front door shuddered under a heavy blow. Not a knock. A strike. The kind made by a wolf who had given up pretending. Nara. A male voice, flat and professional. Open the door. You will not be harmed. She laughed once, short and silent. The baby moved, hard and insistent, both sides of her belly at once, as if responding to the same signal the mark was producing. The door struck again. The bar would hold for perhaps 3 or 4 more strikes. At the western tree line, the 3 wolves in muddy fur began walking toward the lane. Maris pressed her left palm flat against her belly and thought about what Kadrin had said to her in the forest clearing where they always met. Not the promises, not the words about waiting and safety and time. The thing he had said early in their time together, when she had asked him why he trusted her. He had said, "Because you are not afraid of the truth, even when it is inconvenient." Most people are. You are not. She had not understood, at the time, why that mattered so much to him. She understood now. She crossed to the front door in 3 strides and yanked the bar free herself. Not to surrender. She opened it because the wolf on the other side had not expected her to open it from inside, and the half-second of surprise was the only advantage she was going to get. She drove the flat of her boot into the man's sternum before he had registered the movement, and he stumbled backward into the 2 men behind him, and she was through the doorway and into the lane before any of them had recovered. She ran north. Not because north was safe. Because north was the direction none of them were expecting, and right now unpredictable was the only tactic she had left. She heard the wolves shift behind her. She heard shouts. She heard bodies in motion converging from 3 directions at once. And then she heard something else entirely, a sound from the eastern ridge above the village, distant and absolute, carrying across the morning air with the clarity of a bell struck in an empty room. A howl. One single howl, not a pack cry, not a rally signal. Something older and more personal than either. The howl of a wolf that had been searching for a very long time and had just found what it was looking for. The hunters stopped. Every wolf in Varek's party froze in the lane around Maris, their heads turning east in the involuntary, instinctive response of wolves who had just heard something their training had not prepared them for. Maris did not stop running, but she stopped being afraid, because she knew that howl. She had heard it once before, in a forest clearing near the river road, when Kadrin had shifted for the first time to show her his wolf, and the sound that came out of him afterward had dropped every bird from the surrounding trees into absolute silence. He was not close. He was here. The eastern ridge erupted. He came over the ridge in wolf form, and the sight of him stopped every thought in Maris's head completely. She had seen his wolf once before, in a private clearing on a night chosen carefully, when he had asked her with unusual formality if she was ready and then shifted slowly, giving her time to adjust. Even then, knowing what was coming, the reality of him had needed a moment to absorb. There was no adjustment now. Kadrin came over the eastern ridge at full speed, and the wolf that he was in that form was nothing like the careful, controlled version he had shown her. He was vast, dark as scorched timber, with eyes blazing a deep molten gold, and he crossed the distance between the ridge and the village lane in a span of time that defied measurement. Varek's hunters scattered, not strategically. They broke the way prey breaks, individual wolves peeling off in separate directions as the oldest part of their instinct overrode every order Varek had ever given them. 3 made it to the western tree line before Kadrin reached the lane. 2 more followed. The one who had struck her door stood his ground for exactly 3 seconds, and then something in his face changed, and he ran north without looking back. Maris stood in the empty lane and watched Kadrin slow to a stop 10 feet in front of her. He stood very still, his sides heaving from the run, his golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the mark at her collarbone flare so fiercely she pressed her hand to it on instinct. He looked at her hand. He looked at where it was pressed. He shifted. The change was faster than anything she had ever seen, fluid and absolute. And then he was standing in the lane in human form, close enough to touch, after 2 months of distance and silence and terrible imagining. He looked worse than she had expected. The shadows beneath his eyes had the depth of someone who had not slept meaningfully in weeks. His jaw was sharp with the gauntness that came from not eating regularly. His hair was longer than she remembered, and there was dried mud on his left arm from the ridge, and he was looking at her with the same searching quality she had brought to her copper mirror every morning in Crestholm. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "You ran west," he said. His voice was rough, worn down by overuse. "I had every road east covered within a day of the Citadel. You went northwest instead. I knew you would cover the east. I also knew Varek would know you would cover the east." Something shifted in his expression. "You were protecting the route." "I was trying to. And then I spent 2 months in Crestholm working out whether coming to you directly would walk us both into whatever he had waiting." "It would have," Kadrin said. "His men have been staged on 3 approaches to the Ashenmere since the week after the Accord. He wanted me to find you first. He wanted to intercept us together." He paused. "My beta only identified those positions 4 days ago. That is when I started searching the villages instead of the roads." She absorbed this. "You let him call me a fabricator," she said. The words came out level, which was not how they felt. "You let him stand before the assembled packs and say that the mark was false, that I manufactured it to damage his house. You said nothing publicly for 8 weeks. Every statement I made told him which region I was searching. He had people watching the scribes who published the council dispatches. If I acknowledged the bond in writing, I gave him your location within 50 miles. If I denied his claims, the denial itself would narrow the territory." He looked at her steadily. "I chose silence. I hated choosing silence, but you were alive and uncaptured, and I was not willing to trade that for the satisfaction of correcting him publicly." "His silence cost me nothing," she said. "Yours cost me everything." Kadrin went very still. "He told 600 wolves that I lied," she continued. And now the steadiness was harder to hold, and she let it be harder, because she had carried this for 2 months, and she was done carrying it alone. He told them I was a manipulator. He filed legal papers with the High Council. While you chose silence to protect my location, he was building a structure around your silence that he intended to use to destroy us both. I know, Kadrin said quietly. My beta has been dismantling the legal filings for 3 weeks. He took one step toward her. Maris, I chose the wrong tactic, and I am telling you that plainly. But I need you to know that silence was never indifference. She looked at him for a long time. The mark burned between them, steady and insistent, as it had burned every night of the past 2 months. Her free hand moved, the way it had been moving involuntarily for weeks, to the curve of her belly. Kadrin's gaze dropped. The stillness that came over him was the specific, total stillness she had first seen across a treaty hall 11 months ago, when she had not yet understood what it meant. She understood it now. It was not absence. It was the opposite. A man absorbing something too large for any ordinary reaction. His eyes rose to her face. He said her name once, very quietly, as a question with no words attached to it. 6 weeks before the Citadel, she said. I was going to tell you at the River Road clearing, 3 days after the accord. He crossed the distance between them and stopped just short of touching her, his hands hovering with the careful restraint of a man afraid of his own urgency. The movements, he said. Can I feel them? She took his hand and placed it against her belly. He stilled entirely. From 2 distinct places, the baby moved. Kadrin's breath left him in a long, unsteady exhale. His palm pressed flat against her, as if he could feel more through the fabric and the weeks, and all the things they had not been able to say. 2, he said. The midwife in Crestholm thought so. I have thought so for a month. He made a sound that was not any word, and then he straightened and looked at her with his jaw tight, and his eyes bright with something that had no name in the formal language he usually inhabited. He was spared having to find words for it by the sound of boots on the lane behind them. Oren arrived at a controlled run, his gray-streaked hair disordered from riding, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man who had very bad news and had been calculating the right moment to deliver it for the past quarter hour. My king, he said, and then, with careful courtesy, my lady, I am relieved to find you living. What is it? Kadrin said. Oren held out a folded document. The seal on it was broken, pressed originally in Morval black. Varric's ultimatum reached the Ashenmere court 3 days ago. We have been carrying it since. Given what we found at the ridge staging positions, I believe he expected it to be delivered under very different circumstances. Kadrin took the document without opening it. His eyes stayed on Maris. How long? He asked Oren. 40 hours remain of the window. What happens at the end of the window? Maris asked. Oren and Kadrin exchanged a look that passed between men who have known each other long enough to communicate whole paragraphs in a single glance. Tell her, Maris said. All of it. They sat in the empty room above the tanner's workshop, and Oren told her. He told her methodically, starting with the parts that could be stated as facts, before moving to the parts that required interpretation. Maris sat with her hands folded on the table and listened without interrupting, because interrupting would slow the picture from assembling itself. Varric had known about the bond for 5 months before the Greymere Accord. He had an informant inside Kadrin's court. Someone trusted enough to be present at private meetings, to have access to correspondence routes, to know not just that a bond existed but where it had formed, when the mark had been given, and what Kadrin intended to do about it once the political conditions permitted. The informant had also told Varric something else, something that had transformed what might otherwise have been a straightforward political rivalry into a much more calculated campaign. He had told Varric what Maris was. Not who. What. My grandmother's line, Maris said, when Oren reached that part. Oren looked at her steadily. You knew. I suspected. When the mark refused to fade after I fled the citadel. When the bond behaved as if distance and separation meant nothing to it. She had turned it over many times in the small hours above this same workshop, going back to the things her grandmother had told her in the last months of her life. My grandmother said our line carried something the other packs had lost. She called it the speaking. She said the last time it had fully manifested was 4 generations back, and the wolf who carried it had been both celebrated and hunted for it. The founding bloodline, Kadrin said from the window, where he had been standing with his back to the room. He turned. Oren, tell her the rest. Varric did not want to claim you simply to weaken Kadrin's political standing, Oren said. That was part of it. But the more valuable objective was the bloodline itself. A child born of the founding line and the Ashenmere bloodline would carry authority that no council, no law, and no rival house could legitimately contest. Varric needed that child to be his, not Kadrin's. The silence in the room was absolute for a long moment. He wanted the heir, Maris said flatly. He wanted what the heir would represent. The unification of the oldest blood in Solvane with the most powerful current territory. Under his name. Under his house. Oren's voice was steady, but his eyes were not. The accord signing was engineered. He arranged for your assignment to that event through a contact inside Fenwick's household. Every element of that night was designed to produce one of 2 outcomes. Either you submitted to the claiming, or the child was absorbed into his house, or you revealed the bond, and he could use the revelation to publicly delegitimize Kadrin's standing as a sovereign. He wins either way, Maris said. He believed so. That campaign had been over a year in the building. The specific targeting of you came later, when his informant confirmed your bloodline, but the legal framework he built around it, once he had that knowledge, moved quickly. And the ultimatum? Oren glanced at Kadrin once before answering. Varric has filed dissolution papers under the Covenant of Severed Bonds, an ancient provision that allows the High Council to formally dissolve a claiming bond if it is deemed to have been made under false or coerced circumstances. He is arguing that Kadrin's bond with you was formed through manipulation of a common blood wolf, which under the old law constitutes coercion. Oren laid a second document on the table. If Kadrin does not respond formally within 40 hours, the High Council is obligated to rule in the absence of a defense. The dissolution would be automatic. Maris looked at the document, then at Kadrin. He would lose the bond legally, even if the bond itself remained. It would strip the recognition from it, Kadrin said. Any children born of it would be classified as unbonded, outside my line of succession, unprotected by the laws of the Ashenmere. She looked at her own hands on the table for a moment. What is the leverage? She asked. You said he has hostages. Oren's expression changed. Pella, a senior court attendant at the Ashenmere who helped arrange your private visits to the king, and who kept that knowledge to herself when questioned. Varric's people took her 3 weeks ago. She is being held near the capital, along with 2 of my king's own messengers who were intercepted on the road. Maris knew the name like a handprint on her chest. Pella, who was older than anyone in the Ashenmere court and more perceptive than most of them, who had once brought her a warm meal without being asked, and said nothing about why. He wants Kadrin to choose between defending the bond and pursuing justice for what happened at the Greymere Citadel, Maris said. Yes. She looked at Kadrin. He was watching her with the quality of attention she had come to know well, the way he looked when he had already formed a view, but was genuinely interested in hers. He cannot do both within 40 hours, she said. Not from here. The legal process is too slow. No, Kadrin agreed. But I can. I am the witness to both. The only one who can address the dissolution claim and the criminal charge simultaneously. She heard the steadiness in her own voice and was faintly surprised by it. I have to go to the High Council myself, in person, before the 40 hours are finished. Kadrin was quiet for a long moment. Varric will expect me to bring you, he said finally. Then you are not going to bring me, Maris said. I am going to bring myself. The argument lasted until well past midnight. Kadrin was not a man who argued carelessly. He built his objections methodically and without wasted material, and each one he placed before her was genuinely sound. The roads to the capital were watched. Varek's people controlled 3 of the 4 main routes. Going in openly invited ambush. Going in secretly required time they did not have. Maris listened to every objection and then said, "He is expecting you, not me. There is a difference. He will have you watched regardless." "Yes, but he will position his forces to intercept you, which means they will be in the wrong places when I arrive." She spread the roadmap Oren had produced across the table. "The southern route through Ashven adds half a day to the journey, and he does not believe I know it exists." Oren coughed quietly. "She is correct about the Ashven route, my king." Kadrin looked at his beta with an expression that could most precisely be described as restrained. They left before dawn, Maris and Oren by the Ashven road, Kadrin and his wolves by the northern route, loudly enough and visibly enough that Varek's watchers on the high ridges would count the right number of figures going in the wrong direction. The Ashven road was narrow and cold and smelled of peat and old water. Maris rode with Oren at a pace faster than comfortable and slower than she would have preferred. Twice they stopped at narrow points, and Oren scouted ahead in silence before waving her through. "Oren," she said, during the second hour of riding. "The speaking. What does Kadrin know about it?" Oren was quiet for a moment. "He knows what the founding bloodline records say. He recognized it when the bond first formed, which is part of why he moved as carefully as he did in the early months. A wolf carrying the speaking is not simply a fated mate in the conventional sense. The bond between a founding line wolf and an alpha of sufficient standing is amplified through both of them. Its effects radiate beyond them. The kingdom felt it," she said quietly, "when I went into hiding. When a founding bond is severed or disrupted, the wolves in proximity to the stronger partner feel the disruption, instability, restlessness." Oren glanced at her. The 17 packs Varek had under informal fealty began fracturing within 3 weeks of the accord. Several pack leaders withdrew their support without being able to explain exactly why. It is why he accelerated his timeline. He did not have as long as he planned. She had done that. Not deliberately, not as a weapon. Simply by existing at the center of a bond she had not fully understood, and then being torn away from it. The capital appeared on the horizon as the sun reached its midpoint, pale stone towers above the darker mass of the city. Above the council district, the High Council's banner flew alongside Varek's Morvale serpent, and the sight of that serpent rippling above the legal seat of the entire realm made something in Maris's chest go very tight. Oren reined in at the last ridge above the valley road. Below, moving with controlled urgency through the capital gates, were the shapes of Varek's forces. More than she had estimated. "He moved his entire deployment here," Oren said. "Every man he staged on the roads to the Ashenmere." "He got word that Kadrin is taking the northern route," Maris said. She looked at the chamber of assembled packs, the largest building in the council district, its broad stone steps empty at this hour but its doors open. "The 40-hour window closes at midday tomorrow," she said. "I need to be inside before nightfall." She looked at Oren. "Can you get me to the servants' entrance on the eastern side without going through the main gate?" Oren studied her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. "I can," he said. "Then let us not waste the light." The chamber of assembled packs smelled of old stone and lamp oil and the quiet weight of many consequential decisions made across many generations. Maris had been inside it exactly once before, as a girl accompanying Lord Fenwick on administrative business, standing in the back of the public gallery while adults spoke about things she had not yet had the framework to understand. She remembered thinking the room was too large for any single voice to fill it. She had been wrong about that. The chamber was nearly full when she entered through the main doors at the front. Pack leaders occupied the tiered seating curved around the central floor. High Council representatives sat on the raised bench at the far end. Advocates occupied the floor-level tables to either side. And at the petitioner's position, at the center of the chamber floor, stood Lord Alpha Varric of House Morvale. He saw her the moment she came through the doors. The expression that moved across his face was brief and specific. Not surprise. The satisfaction of a man who had laid several possible traps and was now watching one of them spring. Maris walked the length of the chamber to the opposing petitioner's position and took her place facing him across the open floor. She recognized several faces from the Greymere Accord, saw in them the attention of people who had witnessed the beginning of something and were only now understanding what they had been present for. The High Council acknowledges the presence of the secondary petitioner. The council's senior voice called from the bench. You are Maris, formerly of Lord Fenwick's household, bearer of the Mark of Cadrin of the Ashenmere, petitioning in relation to the dissolution claim filed under the Covenant of Severed Bonds? I am, Maris said. You may speak. She had prepared words. Careful, structured words in the language of legal petition that Orin had reviewed with her on the Ashfin Road. She had practiced them until they were steady in her mouth. She set them aside. She spoke instead in the plain language of a woman describing something she had witnessed. She described the Greymere Accord, the registration table, the precise distribution of the torchlight in the upper gallery. She described Varric finding her in 3 seconds among 12 people in shadows. She described the wolves in Morval colors who had materialized as if placed in advance. The right of public declaration invoked before she was given any opportunity to speak. The way Varric's hand had moved toward her collar with the certainty of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times. He was not surprised, she said clearly. He was not startled or calculating how to respond. He was waiting. The entire event, from the moment he entered the citadel to the moment he invoked the declaration, was not opportunism. It was execution. Varric's advocate rose. The petitioner has no documentary evidence to support this characterization. Her account of his expression is opinion, not fact, and should be struck from the record. The testimony continues, the senior voice said. He smiled, Maris said, looking directly at the council bench. When I showed the mark, when I spoke Cadrin's name, Varric smiled. Not because I had surprised him, because I had done exactly what he needed me to do. I had either submitted or given him the air he wanted, or I had revealed the bond and handed him the political weapon he had been building toward for over a year. The chamber had gone very quiet. He told me himself, she said. When every other wolf in that hall was still absorbing the shock, he leaned toward me and said 4 words. He said, "Did you think I did not already know?" She let that settle. He has filed a dissolution claim arguing this bond was coerced, she continued. He has called me a manipulator and the mark fabricated. I am asking this council to understand what that argument actually is. It is not a legal position. It is the completion of the same strategy. If he can dissolve the bond on paper before Cadrin can formally respond, the children I carry lose their standing. The criminal charges against his house are weakened, and Varric wins the thing he has been engineering since before anyone in this room knew my name. Movement at the side of the chamber. Varric's men brought Pella through a door that should not have opened from the inside without council authorization. The old woman walked with her chin up and her hands bound in front of her, and the blade at her side was angled precisely enough that the entire chamber could see it and understand its meaning. Varric spoke for the first time. The witness has made a compelling personal account, he said. His voice was the same voice it had been in the Greymere gallery, even, almost kind. I would ask her to stop speaking now. I would ask it as a courtesy, because I have no wish to involve this elderly woman in what is, ultimately, a legal disagreement between the relevant parties. The blade shifted slightly at Pella's side. Maris looked at Pella. Pella looked back at her across the chamber floor with the expression of someone who had already, privately, made peace with whatever came next. Say it, Pella said quietly. All of it. Whatever you came here to say. Maris turned back to the High Council bench. She took one step forward, and the speaking woke up. She had not known exactly what it would feel like when it happened. She had expected something like pain, the effortful quality of pulling something into the world that did not want to come easily. Her grandmother had spoken of it in those terms as a difficult thing, a thing that cost. It did not feel that way. It felt like releasing something that had been pressing against the inside of her chest for 11 months, looking for the door. The light that rose from her collarbone was not golden like the torches. It was the colorless brilliance of the moment just before full dawn, when the sky is entirely light, but the sun has not yet committed to a direction. It spread outward from the mark, and it did not stop at her skin. Every wolf in the chamber of assembled packs went absolutely still. Not still the way wolves go still when a dominant alpha enters a room. Still in the manner of wolves when something ancient addresses the part of them that lives below language and instinct both, the part that does not have a name in any tongue, but that every wolf carries regardless. Varric's advocate sat down without meaning to. The senior voice on the High Council bench made a small sound and did not finish it. And then the speaking did what it had always been designed to do. It did not alter memory. It did not manufacture anything. It simply made the truth available to feel, the way a lamp makes a room available to see, without changing what was in the room. Every wolf in the chamber felt the Greymere Accord. It came not as an account or legal framing. They felt the weight of the upper gallery railing under cold hands. They felt the quality of the torchlight and the pressure of the crowd below, and the specific texture of fear that lives in the chest of a woman who has been careful for months and has just watched that careful begin to unravel. They felt the moment Varric's eyes found her in 3 seconds in poor light and what that precision meant. They felt his hand rising toward her collar and the ancient, unambiguous wrongness of it. And they felt the moment she had made her choice. Not fear, not desperation. Something older than either. The sound that moved through the chamber was not a word. It was the collective exhale of 200 wolves, experiencing simultaneously a truth they had been given only as argument and now held as direct knowledge. Varric's men at Pella's side took 3 steps backward without coordinating it. Pella straightened her back. On the tiered seating, pack leaders looked at each other with expressions ranging from stunned to something close to grief. The grief of people who had allowed a plausible story to stand in the place of a true one. Varric's face had changed. He had not collapsed. He was not a man who collapsed. But the certainty was gone, and what was underneath it was harder and far less controlled. Founding blood, he said. Not to the council, to himself, or to the air between them, with the flat effect of a man crossing off a variable he had underweighted. He looked at Maris with an expression that was almost respect in its precision. I knew the bloodline was dormant. I did not calculate it activating. No, she said. You planned for the woman you thought I was, not the one I actually am. The blade appeared in his hand so quickly that the chamber barely processed the movement. Not toward Maris, toward the dissolution papers on the council table. If the papers were destroyed before the council could rule, the legal proceedings reset, and he bought himself time that was worth more right now than anything else available to him. He crossed half the chamber floor before the doors at the far end opened. Kadrin of the Ashenmere walked in. Not in wolf form, not at a run, not with his wolves at his back. He came through those doors the way he had once stepped out of a corridored doorway in Draven, and stopped Maris's entire forward motion with the simple fact of his presence. He walked through Varric's assembled men, and they moved out of his path, one after another. Not because they had been given an order, and not because of what he might do to them if they did not. Because of what he simply was. There was a reason they called him the last sovereign. There was a reason his name alone had ended 3 coups without drawing a blade. It was not the territory or the army or the legal authority vested in his title. It was this. The thing that filled a room when he entered it. The thing that was not performed, was not constructed, was simply the unmediated reality of what he had been since the moment he was born into the oldest functioning pack line in Sylvain. He crossed the chamber floor and stopped at Maris's side. He looked at Varric across the open space between them. "Put it down," he said. His voice did not require volume. Varric looked at the blade in his hand, looked at Kadrin, looked at the chamber, where 200 wolves were watching him with the clarity of people who had just felt the unmediated truth of a thing and were now watching him decide what to do about it. He made the calculation that his kind of man always made in the end, the one that measured what was possible against what was not, stripped of the plan, and stripped of the long game and the staged positions and the careful engineering. Just the room and the math. He set the blade on the floor. He straightened. "This is not finished," he said. "It is," Kadrin said. And from the tiered seating, the senior pack leader in the third tier rose to his feet. Then another. Then 6 more. Then the council bench. One by one, until every wolf in the chamber was standing. Not for Varric. Varric understood this. His face told her he understood it precisely. He stood in the center of the chamber of assembled packs, while the oldest law of wolves played itself out around him. The law that did not live in any document, but that every wolf carried in the oldest part of themselves, and the part the speaking had just addressed directly. The law that said, when a truth has been felt, it cannot be legally argued away. Varric's men collected him from either side. He did not struggle. The High Council security moved to secure his people, and Pella's guard simply stepped away from her and joined the movement toward the exits without being escorted. Pella walked across the chamber floor with her bound hands in front of her, and Maris met her halfway and cut the rope with the silver knife that had been in her cloak since Crestholm. Pella looked at her with the expression of someone who had known this was coming and had simply waited for it with patience. "You took long enough," Pella said. Maris laughed, short and raw and real, the first laugh she had produced in 2 months that was not for anyone else's benefit. Kadrin appeared at her side. He put his hand on her back, very gently, and left it there, and she leaned into it because she was done standing upright by herself, and she intended to take full advantage of that. "Together?" she said, the way she had said it once in a letter she had written in the dark above the tanner's workshop, and then burned, because she was not yet ready to mean it that openly. "Always," he said against her hair, "from this moment until everyone that follows. You are never doing this alone again." Outside the chamber of assembled packs, the city of Solvain had no idea yet what had happened in the room at its center. It would know before nightfall. The High Council of Solvain sat in formal session for 11 days. Varric of House Morvale was stripped of every territorial holding gained through informal fealty arrangements in the preceding 4 years. 17 pack leaders formally withdrew the allegiances they had entered under what the council determined had been a sustained pattern of deliberate coercion. The informant inside Kadrin's court, a mid-level records advocate named Taryn, was remanded to the Ashenmere's own justice and received it without appeal. Kadrin's 2 intercepted messengers were released within hours of Varric's detention, unharmed but considerably road-worn. The dissolution claim filed under the Covenant of Severed Bonds was dismissed on the 4th day, unanimously, by a council that had spent 3 days reviewing testimony that could not be argued against because it had been felt rather than merely heard. The covenant itself was suspended pending full review, having been identified as a provision that no legitimate bonded pair had ever needed protection from. Sereth of House Morvale, Varric's daughter, who had been present at none of the events described and who had filed a formal statement with the council within 6 hours of her father's detention, distancing herself from his actions with a specificity that suggested she had been waiting for the opportunity for some time, was permitted to retain the family seat in the Northern Corridor. The council noted that she had provided documentation supporting 4 of the 11 counts against her father. What she had understood about his plans and when she had understood, It was a question the council examined and ultimately left to her to carry. Pella returned to the Ashenmere with the first party that traveled north, ahead of everyone else, on the grounds that someone needed to ensure the residential wing had been properly maintained during the prolonged absence of its king, and that she did not trust this task to anyone who had not done it correctly for the past 30 years. The bond between Maris and Cadrin was completed the evening after the council session closed, in the private clearing near the river road where they had always met. In a snowfall that was lighter than winter and heavier than spring and smelled of cold water and pine. No witnesses, no ceremony, no assembled pack leaders to observe and record for the legal archives. Just the two of them, in the dark, in the place that had been theirs before anything else was. She pressed her palm flat against his chest, the way she had in every clearing and corridor, and whispered meeting of the past year. And she felt his heartbeat, and she said his name, and the bond that had been partial and burning and aching since the night he had first marked her completed itself in the way that only a founding line bond could. Not through the exchange of wounds, but through the exchange of intent. Two people facing each other with everything known and nothing hidden and choosing, in full knowledge of both, to be precisely this. The speaking rose from her, quiet and warm in the winter air. And Cadrin, who had been stillness in the face of coups and dissolution claims and the weight of an entire kingdom's instability, came completely undone, for a long moment, in the dark of a river road clearing with snow falling on both of them, and she held him through it, and was held in return, and the mark on her collarbone stopped burning for the first time since the night it was made. It did not go cold. It settled. The way a fire settles when the room is finally warm enough. Their children were born in late spring, when the river road clearing was green and the light came in at the low slant of early evening gold. A boy, first. Dark-haired, with his father's quality of stillness even in his first hours, and eyes that Pella declared from the doorway were going to be gold once they settled on a color. A girl, 12 minutes later, who arrived with a brightness about her that had no specific feature to attach it to, and who pressed her tiny palm flat against Maris's collarbone at the mark, with the unhesitating accuracy of a child who had already known exactly where that mark was for a very long time. Cadrin sat at the edge of the bed with both of them against his chest and said nothing for a long while. There was nothing in his expression that required words. There was nothing in the room that required anything except the long exhale of something that had been held tight for a year, finally releasing into a shape that was not pain. Outside the window, the wolves of the Ashenmere were not howling. They were simply present. The way the pack is always present at the edges of an alpha's hearing. A warmth in the periphery. A knowledge that the territory was whole, and the bond at its center was sealed, and the thing that had been wrong for a long time was no longer wrong. Maris looked at the ceiling for a while, then at the window, then at Cadrin's face above the two small heads resting against him. "They are going to be extraordinary," she said. "They already are," he said. "Their mother saw to that before they were born." She reached up and covered his hand where it rested against the girl's back. In the weeks that followed, the Ashenmere settled into a peace that the wolves who lived there described, when they tried to describe it at all, as a return to something rather than an arrival at something new. The instability of the preceding months lifted in the gradual, undramatic way that weather lifts, when the season genuinely changes rather than merely threatens to. Sylvain began to understand what it had in its center. Not just an alpha king and his bond, not just a political resolution to a year of carefully engineered crisis, something older and quieter than either. Something the speaking had briefly made visible in the chamber of assembled packs, and that had not stopped being true when the light faded. A line continuing. A bond that had fought through engineering and silence and exile and legal dissolution and the deliberate dismantling of truth to find itself whole. Maris stood at the window of the Ashenmere court one evening in the week after the children were named, looking out at the territory that had become hers not by ceremony, but by the simple, inarguable fact of the bond, and she thought about the scribe who had written about the last forced claiming in the Greymere citadel. The one who had described it as the worst thing he had ever witnessed, and had never recovered his composure enough to say why. She understood him now in a way she had not when she first read his account. It was not the violence of the act that had shaken him. It was the nearness of something being lost that should never have been in danger. She touched the mark at her collarbone, which no longer burned but rested there with the settled warmth of something that had finally become permanent. Behind her, from the next room, she heard Cadron's voice, low and unhurried, saying something to the boy that made the boy produce a sound she had not heard him make yet, a laugh, small and new, and utterly unguarded. She turned away from the window. She went toward it. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this story found you.